In this episode, we talk about India's mission to Venus, that is Shukrayaan-1. We also talk about incessant rains in Chennai that have caused massive waterlogging and flood warnings in many regions. But first, we talk about India's supercomputers. Hi, I am Niharika Nanda, and you are listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Last month, Prime Minister Narendra Modi inaugurated 3 Param Rudra supercomputers worth Rs 130 crores. Developed indigenously under the National Supercomputing Mission or NSM, the 3 new supercomputers are located in Pune, Delhi and Kolkata. On the occasion, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that the supercomputers will provide state-of-the-art advanced facilities to the scientific community in India and make up a high-performance computing system tailored for weather and climate research. India started developing its own supercomputers in 2015 under the NSM. To learn more about supercomputers and the National Supercomputing Mission, we have Indian Express's Anjali Marar joining us. Anjali, can you tell us what a supercomputer is?
Supercomputer is a magnanimous looking and a huge system which can almost take up your entire room. It's unlike any of our PCs or computers that we are familiar with seeing and using. And supercomputers have a very special purpose. They're designed for a special purpose. And they perform extremely complex and time-consuming tasks of computing, calculation, which is otherwise not possible by humans. So essentially, supercomputers are super large computing systems. They're very expensive and they have huge computing capacities, and it can be measured in flops.
Right. And in 2015, the National Supercomputing Mission was launched. So can you share with us what the mission is about?
In the 1990s is when India had the first idea of building its own supercomputers. And back then, India did not have the technological know-how of building supercomputers. And India was denied the technological know-how. And that's how the journey of supercomputers in India began with the Param series of supercomputers. Then for several years, there were some of the other efforts in building supercomputers. But it was only in 2015 that the Union government decided to launch the National Supercomputing Mission. And it is a 4,500 crore mission, which envisioned to establish almost 70 supercomputers all across the country. And these supercomputers would be established in research institutions, in higher education institutions, and all these places where a large amount of data would be generated and they needed to be computed. So essentially, this is a mission mode program, which was planned in 3 phases. So currently, the 3rd phase is going on. And so far, over 20 odd supercomputers of varying computing capacities have been installed in institutions like IITs, or the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, several other institutions. That's how the National Computer Mission is currently going on.
And what is the significance of this mission?
So as I mentioned, there are various phases in technological developments of any country. And so, for example, there was a time when oil was considered to be a resource and a country having oil was rich. Then there came a time of computing and IT. And now it's a time for data. So supercomputers essentially help you deal with data and deal with large amounts of data, compute it, and bring out some analysis out of it. So in all the areas where large amounts of data would be generated, for example, climate modeling, disaster management, or computation required in astrophysics, atomic energy, biology, big data. So all these across areas where data is crucial and large volumes of data are crucial, in order to study and in order to make some sense of the data and process them into useful information, we require such powerful computer systems, and that's where supercomputers come into play. And essentially, supercomputer need not be used only by one institution or the host institution. It is essentially a national facility. So it can be used by a number of research institutions, number of people. And since the launch of supercomputing system itself, there have been over 1.5 lakh personnel who have been trained and hundreds and hundreds of people who have been using this facility. So it's essentially a big push to the research community in all these areas that I mentioned.
Right. And Anjali, you talked about training. So when it comes to developing and operating these supercomputers, how are people trained for this?
So essentially, this whole mission is being spearheaded by 2 ministries. that is Ministry of Electronics and IT and Department of Science and Technology. And under these ministries, there are two nodal agencies. That is, one is Center for Development of Advanced Computing, which is CDAC, and the other is Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. So CDAC is mainly focusing on all these training, and CDAC has centers all across the country. So they are the ones who are primarily driving the training programs and training the personnel to not just use, but also to develop indigenous supercomputers. So all these supercomputers that I'm mentioning under NSM are largely indigenous. And recently, just last month, 3 new supercomputers, that is Param Rudra, three of them were deployed. And so essentially CDAC takes care of the training component.
Right. And tell us more about the Param Rudra, that is the 3 new supercomputers that have been launched last month. And also of the 70 supercomputers target, how many have already been installed till date?
Right. So since the launch in 2015, so launch means it has to have all the components, assembly. So since 2015, more than 20 supercomputers have been indigenously built and readied under the National Supercomputing Mission. And recently, that is in September, the Prime Minister unveiled 3 Param Rudra supercomputers. So the first one was at Pune. This is at the Giant Meter Wave Radio Telescope, which is a 1 petaflop computing supercomputer. Then 2 838 teraflop capacity systems were deployed in the Inter-University Accelerator Center, Delhi, and the last one being at the S.N. Bose National Center for Basic Sciences, Kolkata. Essentially, 20 odd or a little over 20 supercomputers have been established, mostly in research institutions and institutions of higher education, IITs, NITs, and IISc. So these are the primary recipients of where the supercomputers are being hosted so far.
Right. And Anjali, you mentioned in the beginning that these supercomputers can process and analyze massive amounts of data. So can you tell us about the fields where research will become much easier, all thanks to these supercomputers?
So any field which generates large volumes of data, and by large volumes, I can simply say that these are in terabytes and, huge volumes. So essentially, some of them I can name would be climate modeling. So there are several climate models which the meteorologists run on a daily basis, and they have a lot of data which is being computed. And then it is used to issue predictions or make forecasts of various timescales. Then disaster management. So suppose if the disaster managers want to understand how a potential disaster is likely to strike, so they will make use of all the historical data and then bring out a chart or bring out a prediction, or something like astrophysics or biology, wherein huge volumes of data are generated. It is essentially a tool, it is essentially a system which is helping humans to compute it. And without this, possibly it would have taken several years, or it would have been nearly impossible to process any of these data. So essentially, this is an important intervention which has come in for India without depending on any other country now with the National Supercomputing Mission.
And Anjali, how do we see these supercomputers helping India as a country in its growth?
So though India launched the National Supercomputing Mission in 2015, India is still way behind several of the advanced countries like China or US. They have far more advanced supercomputers and far more number of supercomputers than what India has. So we are nowhere in the global competition at present. Maybe there's only 1 or 2 supercomputers in the top 400, top 500. Every year there is a ranking list which is issued. So India still has a lot of work to be done and a long way to go. But with this National Supercomputing Mission, at least it has made a beginning. And the whole idea is to set up 70 supercomputers over a period of time. And it will be connected as a grid into the National Knowledge Network. And that's how it will give a great impetus to India's core research areas and bring it to along with many of the leading countries. So since India began late, maybe we have a lot to catch up.
Next, we talk about India's first mission to Venus that ISRO aims to launch in March 2028. This will be India's second interplanetary mission after Mars Orbiter mission that was launched in 2013. The mission will carry scientific instruments from India and abroad to examine the surface and subsurface of Venus, its interaction with the Sun, and more. To get a deeper insight into the mission, its implementation, and the challenges that it might face during the exploration of the Earth's evil twin, as Venus is called, we are joined by Indian Express's Anonna Dutt. Anonna, why is it significant for India to be launching its own mission to Venus?
Now that the space sector has opened for private players, Indian Space Research Organization is now focusing on more of scientific and exploratory missions. And of course, we have done missions in the past to one planet, which is to Mars, which was launched in 2013. But since then, we have done other good scientific missions, such as Chandrayaan, of course, 3 Chandrayaan missions. We have done a mission called AstroSat, which is a space-based observatory. We have a sun observatory, which is Aditya L1 now. So we have done quite a few scientific missions, but when we launch the Venus mission, it will be India's second mission to another planet. That is an important thing and good for, scientific findings and looking into, say, the history of how Earth became Earth.
Right. And what would you say are the primary objectives of the Shukrayaan-1 mission?
So basically, it would be an orbiter, which means a satellite that will go around the planet, and it will study the atmosphere of the planet, which is quite different from Earth, and try to understand what makes it so different. It will look at the surface and subsurface of the planet, and also it would look at the interaction of the planet with sun. So that interaction also will be studied by the scientific payloads that will be on the satellite.
Right. And when we say that ISRO is about to send a spacecraft to Venus, what does that exactly mean? How does it work?
The satellite will, go around the Earth for several orbits. So the orbit would be gradually increased, and then the satellite would be slingshot towards Venus. Once it has traveled the distance, which would take about 140 days, and reaches near Venus and its force of, gravity, the satellite will then get captured into the orbit of Venus. The thing with this mission, however, which is different from any other mission that India has done so far, is that the satellite would enter the Venus orbit in a very elliptical orbit. So one end of it would be close to the planet at about 500 kilometers from the surface. And the other end of the orbit would be 60,000 kilometers away. So it will be a very elliptical orbit. So this orbit, has been determined based on the fuel considerations. But at this orbit, none of the science experiments that the mission needs to do can be achieved. So for that, the orbit has to be lowered down. And it can either be a very circular orbit of 300 by 300 kilometers or, a slightly elliptical orbit of 200 by 600 kilometers. But in any case, the satellite will have to be brought down. And this is where India will perform for the very first time something called aerobraking.
Anonna, you mentioned that India will be using aerobraking for the very first time in space exploration. So, can you break down the concept for us?
When we say aerobraking, what is it? It's basically a process in which, when the satellite comes close to the surface of Venus, so say when it reaches the orbit at a point where it's the closest to Venus, it will be pushed down further to slightly enter the atmosphere. So it almost skims through the atmosphere of Venus. And that creates a friction, that creates a drag on the satellite and reduces its speed. And once the speed goes down, the orbit also reduces a little. That's how, after repeated maneuvers like this, where the satellite will slightly touch the outer atmosphere of Venus, the highly elliptical orbit in which it enters, that would be reduced to the one that is required for the scientific experiments. And this whole process would take about 6 months.
But why is it that Venus is considered a difficult planet to study as compared to other planets like Mars?
Venus is referred to as the evil twin sometimes. This is because, of course, its mass, density, size, it's quite similar to Earth. And in fact, scientists saying that at one point of time, it might even have had liquid water. So that makes it very similar to Earth. But, Venus differs in very significant ways, in comparison to Earth. So first of all, Venus has a very high surface temperature, surface temperature higher than Mercury, which is even closer to the sun than Venus. And this scientists think is because of a runaway greenhouse effect. So as we all know, water vapor is a greenhouse gas. And when there is water vapor accumulating in the atmosphere, it traps heat. So what happened in Venus is scientists think that the surface water that was present evaporated because of its proximity to the sun and went into the atmosphere, which again led to, the temperatures. So the water vapor stored more heat, the temperatures increased, and further more water from the surface evaporated. This is the reason Venus has an extremely high surface temperature. Second, it also has extremely high atmospheric pressure. So the atmospheric pressure on Venus is almost similar to what you would face, say, 1 kilometer under the sea on Earth. So, these two factors combined, the heat and the pressure, means that any landers that have been sent to the planet could not last more than just a few hours. So they were able to send some data for a couple of hours and then they died. Other than that, of course, Venus, another, reason why it sort of is called the evil twin is because this atmosphere is, largely made up of carbon dioxide and it has sulfuric acid clouds. So that also makes it a very hostile place to study. And another significant difference when it comes to Venus is that it rotates very slowly on its axis.
And Anonna, considering all the difficulties that you just mentioned, how is the Indian mission looking to mitigate these challenges in its process of exploring Venus?
First of all, the challenges that we mentioned, that is the extreme heat and the extreme pressure of the planet, is applicable only to landers which go to the surface of the planet. The Indian mission so far is supposed to be an orbiter. That means it will be a satellite that will just go around the planet. So it would not face that kind of heat or pressure that can harm it. Neither will it go into the atmosphere too deep so that it gets harmed by, say, the sulfuric acid clouds, like I mentioned. So that would not happen. But one big challenge for the mission is, as I mentioned, aerobraking is something that India would be doing for the very first time. And the aerobraking has to happen very precisely. So since the satellite will get repeatedly pushed into the atmosphere of Venus, of course the outer atmosphere, but the scientists have planned this window very carefully, because if the spacecraft enters the atmosphere too deep, then it will face a lot of friction and it will burn up. But if it does not enter deep enough, then it would take a very long time for the satellite to achieve the final orbit in which the scientific studies would be done.
Right. And what are the key instruments that will be included in the entire mission? And can you tell us what is a payload?
A payload is a scientific instrument. Basically, payload is the word that you would use for, like, say, a satellite is the payload for the launch vehicle and the scientific experiments are the payloads for the satellite. So far, if we're talking about the scientific, experiments on the mission, India has shortlisted some 17 experiments from within the country and 7 experiments from abroad. And this includes a lot of different ways to study the atmosphere, the surface, and the Sun-Venus interaction, like I mentioned. So the payload on board would be, say, a thermal camera. There would be a synthetic aperture radar. There would be an experiment to study the flow of the interplanetary dust. There would be an experiment to study the high energy particles that are entering the Venus's atmosphere. There would be payloads that would study the composition, structure, the thermal state of this atmosphere as well. So there would be several scientific studies included.
Right. And Anonna, how does this mission fit into India's overall space program?
This would be a part of ISRO's, focus on scientific missions. So, of course, we are now looking more towards exploring different planets and carrying out interplanetary missions. I mean, of course, largely right now, there is a lot of focus on ISRO's two key missions. One is the Chandrayaan, which will be the Chandrayaan-4 mission would come up in the future. And of course, the second is the key Gaganyaan mission, which will see humans in space and then finally culminate with, creation of our own space station. These are scientific experiments in and around Earth's orbit or the Earth's moon in the case of Chandrayaan. But the study of Venus is also a planetary study. It's a very scientific study that can help us understand the past of Earth. And it's one that has been undertaken by, say, several of the space agencies. And ISRO will also be doing it as part of its scientific mission.
And in the end, we talk about the situation in Chennai. With the northeast monsoon bringing incessant rains and triggering flood warnings in Tamil Nadu, Chief Minister M.K. Stalin declared a public holiday for schools, colleges and government offices in Chennai and neighbouring districts of Tiruvallur, Kanchipuram and Chengalpattu for today. The decision comes as Indian Meteorological Department predicts more rainfall for the state. Indian Express's Arun Janardhanan reported that the IMD forecast suggests that the worst is yet to come, with rains expected to intensify today before tapering off by 18th October. The IMD has issued a red alert for Chennai and other districts, forecasting heavy to very heavy rainfall over the next 2 days. In response to the havoc caused by the heavy rains, the state has set up 931 relief centers, ensuring that food and medical care are available to those affected by the floods. The Regional Meteorological Center in Chennai reported that the city recorded an average of 6.9 centimeters of rainfall between 8:30 on Monday and 8 a.m. on Tuesday, with areas like Ennore receiving as much as 10 centimeters. Arun wrote that the city's arterial roads, often prone to flooding, were submerged under several inches of water. Public transportation was severely impacted, with only a handful of buses operating in the morning hours, while auto rickshaw drivers abandoned the streets for safety concerns. The government, learning from past monsoon disasters, has mobilized significant resources to combat the crisis. 26 teams from the National Disaster Response Force and State Disaster Response Force have been deployed across 5 coastal districts, with special attention given to Chennai. Boats, tractors equipped with pumps and emergency relief materials have been strategically placed in flood-prone areas. On Monday, Chief Minister M.K. Stalin visited several residential localities in the city. Deputy Chief Minister Udhayanidhi Stalin has been visiting several areas in the city since Monday night to coordinate relief efforts and monitor the waterlogging issues. Power supply has remained stable in most parts of the city, but Tangedco, the city's electricity provider, has been forced to shut down power in a few localities prone to flooding. Air travel has also been severely impacted, with 12 flights cancelled and 23 flights delayed at the Chennai International Airport due to bad weather and poor visibility, Arun reported. Passengers have been advised to check with airlines for updates before heading to the airport. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's episode was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Ichha Sharma and me, Niharika Nanda. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcast and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.